I had this idea that we would do this local reading group and then the online thing, and that's actually worked. And it's been really fun for me, but almost no one who comes to my local reading group comes to this one. And so I guess that means that people really don't want to do it twice. I find it incredibly generative, and it's really helped me. You know, I go into that local reading group and I say all kinds of stupid shit and people argue with me. And then by the time I come here, I like really know what I'm talking about. So it's been great for me. But I think that format maybe doesn't make sense in a certain, because it seems like it feels like there's been two separate tracks, two separate conversations, and that there isn't a lot of continuity. And so like, and I actually know the people in the local reading group best, but I can't really like get them to step up here because they don't come here, or maybe they watch it afterwards. And you know, so and it feels like increasingly I talk to a lot of people who are like, yeah, I'm loving this series. I've been watching it on YouTube. You know, it's kind of like, which is cool, but that's like, you know, me and or maybe some other people generating like content, which is cool, but that's like that's not participation. I think it goes back to actually that point about that, you know, Paul Mattick was saying in the last session about, you know, the difference between producing a group and producing a journal is that like as the group became less and less successful, the journal became more and more successful. And so like content and participation are not necessarily the same thing, and sometimes might be at odds. Like generating really good content is not the way to generate really good participation, and vice versa.
Well, I have a question for, my voice is kind of lost here. That's fine. And I'm a little into the weather, but hi guys. Hi Jasper. But I'm just for other kinds of study group and discussion groups done like this. This is kind of for Red May. Like when there's not like a mandatory thing around participation, or when it's just put out broadly. I'm just wondering if this is any different than any of the other things that Red May has done. Because it just, I mean, it's been the times that I've been able to participate, it's been super awesome. And I've talked to other people around the country, including some people out in Michigan who participated, who were really excited too. And it's kind of like, you know, it's like one of those things that you get to kind of come into and then leave. And I'm just wondering for Red May, who puts on things similar to this, if this is different or similar than other things like this. That's all. Because I guess I saw it more in the vein of like, you're doing kind of political education for people rather than it's becoming a new group.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if Mahim would want to respond to that, or.
Yeah, I think you as Red May. There's also, I don't know who here is here as Red May, if that's Philip or someone else, but
I think Mahim is hiding behind it.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah. Hi. Sorry. Oh, that's right. Right. Hi.
We have a couple different local groups here in Seattle, one of which is sort of working around this series, although a little bit more asynchronously than the reading per month. And then we have another separate reading group that's sort of a long-term Red May affiliated kind of thing, where it's pretty big and open, and a lot of people tend to float in that as well. But as far as hosting projects like this that are sort of extended and bringing people in and on kind of a rolling basis, this is relatively new territory for us. We have usually just done one-off events in the past, maybe something that's a sort of kind of like a bricolage series of some related content around a theme, but by and large, this sort of rolling thing is new. So I don't know if that helps answer the question or obscures it. I don't know, but you know, we're finding out too. So yeah.
And Jasper, this is like more regarding reflection, you know, on this reading series. I really wish like, we had like, so all the text was like really new for me. And it spanned like such a big amount of like time and content that if it would have been like a little more structured in some way, I would have had like, and like, I mean, like during discussions, it would have really helped me get a hang of things more, but that could just be like, specific to me and not the whole group.
Mm-hmm. So structured in the sense of, lectures that covered the material more. Yeah. Right. Which is more, puts someone in the position more of being a teacher, but which is my job.
But not necessarily here,
Yeah. No, well, no. I mean, that's the thing is I do that to earn money, sometimes more than I want, especially right now. So.
I'll just say one other quick thing, which is that in some of the breakout groups, kind of along those lines, some people were feeling like way over their head in terms of being able to contribute too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But
for sure. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I mean, that may be almost inevitable for something, I don't know that there's any way to encounter this material that doesn't involve jumping in the deep end. Like I think with just communism and Marxism in general, there's just no shallow end. It's just diving into the deep always. I mean, maybe there are some kind of texts that'll walk you through it, but I don't know how we would do that with this stuff, which requires, either we would spend, months reading the history to be able to understand the texts beforehand, or you kind of just have to be a bit lost until you're not. But I do feel that. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Just as far as like a reflection on, I've really enjoyed it, especially three of us have been like talking a lot before the sessions and then after the sessions and for hours on the text and really enjoying it. I feel like when the actual session starts, at least for me, like it's like a bit unclear, like when to jump in, kind of. Like I know for you, Jasper, that like you don't want it to be just you talking and everyone listening and to have it more participatory, but especially when, like you said, like just the nature of it, there's so much information, it's hard to know where to begin a lot of times. And I think I don't have an answer to that. I think what has been going has been really valuable, but if like you wanted it to be less you being teacher, I think it definitely could be. I think a lot of people probably would love to jump in if we could figure out a way to I don't know exactly how to explain.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, if we had the kind of the text before us in some way, we were looking at the texts. I mean, in some ideas, I had this thought that would people would have done that before with other people, like, and then it's kind of, you're ready for a bit more, but that, yeah, that might be too ambitious. But yeah, thank you, Brian.
Jasper, by having the text before, did you mean your particular work or the
no, like having read
readings?
The text with other people before and like kind of gone through them text by text, which is sort of what I do when we meet with the local reading group. But I realize, a lot of people don't have the option to participate in something like that. And so like, this is the one for that.
What if you would try formulating a set of questions and inviting people to jump in who feel that they have something to say in response to those? Like, here are the 5 issues that I, Jasper, see in thinking about June 1968 and the context of the history of my work with council. Here are the 5 questions I have. Please, does anybody have to say anything to say about the first one of them? And that gives a kind of structure without telling people what they have to talk about.
Yeah. It's true. Well, I'm interested in how these texts appear to people. What is the difference between, say the Proman Gregoire text and the text that we have translated by Root and Branch, that is the International Correspondance Ouvrière, which I've learned to pronounce as ECO, thanks to Paul. And then I provided that short kind of history from Ami Simone about how you get from socialisme ou barbarie, that is topics of last week, to, eco. And then the Guy Debord text, I think, is interesting because it develops what, I think you think of as the critique of militancy, which both eco and, and particularly the preface and the Root and Branch share with Gregoire. The Proman Gregoire text. And in some ways, like, the critique of militancy, I think, comes out of the SI in an interesting way, that they're very critical of this idea of militants as like the people who bring ideas to the masses. And yet, the SI had this idea of being, because they were coming out of the avant-garde, they still had this idea of like scandal and provocation and like doing things. And so, of course, and they end up kind of more removed from it. They're like in their own occupation during May 68, sending telegrams to Moscow and Beijing and doing other kind of avant-garde stunts that are fairly sterile. Whereas I think the critique of militancy becomes more interesting in the Saint-Cyr occupation, which they didn't participate in, but ECO did. So that's the place where, ECO and Proman, they're all there. So I'm just interested in how all these things, this kind of network, appears to you guys. But I think to make it sensible, I would have to write a kind of digest. Are there things people liked in any of these texts that were interesting? Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, just to start with the Debord is I thought it was quite interesting. He was talking about stars and the kind of micro celebrities of '68 who were in combat against each other and that was the kind of residues of past struggle were kind of interfering with some of the more kind of some of the discussions and debates that were going on at the time. And then he kind of talks about this, like how we must more consciously think about whether we're going to discourage workers. So even before they even before they into the factories, it's like these kind of clearing of the decks that had to occur in a very short space of time. And I thought it was kind of interesting I think it was in the Action Committee pamphlet, which was where they were talking about how students in the universities had not realized the social character of the factories, and that because of this struggle that started in the universities over they hadn't understand that the universities, in a sense, had been turned into no one's property by the students, and that the character of the factories was somewhat different, and the subdivisions of class within that.
Right. And that's actually a huge point of difference between the two texts. Whereas, Eco are quite clear that they say the students are workers who've taken over their workplace. I think that that's quite at odds with the perspective of the Proman Gregoire, which, I think quite beautifully, states like the students did not take over the universities at the Sorbonne, Saint-Cyr, Nanterre, and elsewhere. The university was proclaimed social property. The universities became ex-universities. The buildings were open to the entire society, to students, teachers, workers, to anyone who wanted to come. And I think that is a thoroughly modern perspective. And in some ways, like we've seen that model repeated again and again. And it's in some ways the grammar of like Occupy and this which I think, I want to say goes back to the idea of the commune as like this thing that is both self-organization, but not the self can't be defined and people come from outside, and I think that that's the kind of return of that concept, which in some way, like now the key one for contemporary struggles that you see again and again. The Atlanta forest right now, this week. Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite instructive to compare the two texts.
Jasper, or anyone, who would you say like the audience is for the shoe texts, and how are they different? Because I found that, or at least like trying to think about it, an interesting difference, because with the Perlman and the other, I mean, they're writing like at the time and to an audience of people who are either involved or nearby and interested in it, right?
Well, no, they're writing a reflection for an English language audience, like after the fact.
So it is much later, because weren't some of them written like at the time, or were they just like notes taken at the time and then not made public until later?
I think they wrote it when he came back. I think he wrote it when he came back after in 69.
Okay, I thought some of them were during and some of them.
I think some of it's based on translations of things, and it's like putting it together.
Okay, but even then, like, so one has a, an American audience and the other maybe more. I don't know.
Right.
If you think that makes much of a difference,
well, the other one,
what their purpose is in writing.
The other one I actually know about because I found it and translated it.
Right.
So that it was a typical eco product, namely it was written by members of ECO who worked in different places. So all the reports from the different workplaces were members of the group who worked in those workplaces.
Right.
So those are like firsthand accounts. This is what we did in the insurance company. This is what we did at the university. This is what we did in this office and so forth. So that was part of their idea, which is that you collect information and make it public, distribute it. This is what happened. Mm-hmm. But because they thought this was a particularly important event, they collected those testimonies and information and put it in the context of an analytical article in which they tried to say, on the one hand, this is this political economic situation in France that produced this, and this is the communist future to which it points. So they wanted to say, these events are not just interesting events that happened in Paris over a 2-month period, but they were a response to something that's been developing for a while. And why did it happen? So they wanted to understand it. And why is it important that they want to say, it has these implications.
Right.
So I would say that's probably why they stressed the idea that, they knew, of course, they didn't mean that the students were running the university in the sense of taking over their workplace, but that's where I thought that was actually an interesting idea. The students didn't begin by saying, we have to go and get other people to do something, but we're going to go where whereas our workplace as students and take it over and we use it for our own purposes, which is agitation and spreading the strike.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's the key point. And I think also the kind of, the overlap.
Yeah. Yes. And, there's a deep sympathy between the two.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in some ways,
side.
Right. They are on the same side. And I think in some ways that the readership would have been the same because, what we experience as I mean, this was all part of a kind of a large extended milieu in some sense. I mean, even in France, and the divisions the Probin-Gregoire text can't really be put on the side of so-called communization theory, although I think its insights are quite similar to those that Dauvet and his comrades develop afterward. But it was all the same group of people trying to make sense of what had happened. And they had been, part of these groups that were entirely marginal. And in 68 kind of launched them into prominence. And, in some sense, we owe the kind of renaissance of council communism to 68, which brought all these people, made all these people interested in these ideas. And, it's like, if you read the Gary Roth biography of the other Paul Mattick, it's like a lot of the publishing happens, after this moment, and a lot of the interest in his work, is from the New Left in Germany and Italy and in the United States, and I mean it's ridiculous how hard it was to find publishers for that work before that. I mean, it seems just shocking the kind of the lack of interest, but then suddenly there was a readership for this. Suddenly there was interest in these ideas, and in some sense we owe. My argument is that council communism is, as we know it, is in some sense a product of 68. Of course, it's not, because it's also this extended. These people kind of keeping the flame alive in the wilderness. But it's also a product of 68. And then, communization theory as such, which, I'm in some sense a partisan of, and is where I, still lights up my brain. A lot of my thinking comes from is, emerges from the same moment. And it's a kind of the self-critique of the council communism of the time. But, if you see them as, emerging from this same moment, they look a lot more similar in some sense. And that's, part of my idea here is a kind of rapprochement between these two theories, which I think, that Dauvet's critique is, it's partly a misfire. And you can see why it's a misfire just by reading the Root and Branch introduction, which singles out in the eco text this labor voucher thing, and it's like, well, I don't know, but that's the thing that Dauvet builds his entire critique of the ultra left around. It's this idea of the labor voucher, and it's going to preserve the value form, and you have to destroy the value form. But clearly, some group of people had already moved beyond that, and if you read the introduction that the other Paul Mattick writes to the Jan Appel's Fundamentals of Communist Production and Distribution, he also says the same thing, which is like, no, I don't think labor vouchers make any sense anymore. So if that's the key difference, well, then, maybe it's only a difference for, some of the eco people and not really this kind of extended, milieu. And so that's one of my interests here. Is how much is communization theory still really, council communism, and maybe opposed to certain versions of it. But then how much are there actual differences? And I think that there's, there is something new in the 68 moment that is, starts to get digested from that moment onward, but that, I don't actually think that the participants really fully understood it. In some sense, we're only maybe understanding it now, now that we've had 50 years of history in the wake of it.
Well, somebody was talking before about the, genealogy of all this, and the same thing. The big break that happened for all of these people was, they had all come through the Communist Party and then Trotskyism.
Right.
not necessarily, some started with Trotskyism, but then like even Henri Simon he was in the Communist Party, he was in the resistance and then the Communist Party, and then but that was it. Then he didn't have to go through Trotskyism.
Right.
But a lot of them then had, that's why you had most of the eco people had been Trotskyists, and those were going concerns, like the student organizations in Paris. There was a communist one and a Trotskyist one. They each had a party, and they were the official student organization. So you had these people who had been through that history, and they already had this is no good. And I think we talked about that last time. That sort of the material around socialism and Barbary and why CLR James. I mean, he's trying to figure out, what do we do without instead of the party or without the party?
Right.
So they could see the party thing is no good, especially after 1956. That was really the beginning. That was the end of it, especially for people in Europe. Mm-hmm. And then this thing happened, and I think it really crystallized. It began to. It was really the events of '68 that began to suggest, because of what happened. Oh, this is what happens when large numbers of people spring into action and have to organize themselves, and that gave a meaning to the old texts that some people had been looking at or discovered. I mean, it's very striking to think of the differences between the French situation and the German situation. With the Germans excavated the history and republished all of the documents, and they did enormous work of collecting all the information you could possibly have about the Council Revolution of 1919 and made it public. Mm-hmm. The French began to try to figure out, okay, what they tried to make a theory. It's such a national difference. It's like a parody, but it's true. With very little historical knowledge. Serge Brissonnet read German and knew everything about the history of the Council movement, but most of them knew nothing. Right. But they could see, that's a direction that is an alternative to the party. It's something concrete, and it's connected to what we actually just experienced in real life. So it really was a moment which sort of showed them the way out of not knowing what to do after the disillusionment with Leninism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course, he couldn't land, because at the same time you had all the Maoists, and the Leninism was also had a renaissance at the same time, a bigger one. Right. Yeah. It wasn't a historical progression. Leninism came back with a vengeance. Right.
I think that what's interesting to me about the moment, and what I've been trying to figure out, or what I think I figured out, is that there is a way in which 68, there is something that the Maoists and the Council Communists and everyone kind of shares in this moment. And I think that it gets at what's new. And I mean, you could even possibly say that it's true of the Cultural Revolution. I think it's true of the 70s, the long 70s in Italy, is that I think that there's one way to understand 68 as, in some sense, developing from what the Situation International calls the critique of separation, right? And because a lot of what the students were pissed off about were these kinds of arbitrary kind of rules and regulations and the kind of very structure of the division of labor, as it was opposed in the university. And in a sense, a lot of the factory struggles too were about this kind of imposition of the division of labor. And so I think that if you so you could say that there's the division of labor, represented chiefly between the division between university, mental labor, and the factories, manual labor. I mean, there's a lot of kind of emphasis on this, on overcoming that divide, and that's some part of the kind of idealism of the student movement, right? But also the divisions between immigrant and French labor, which you see in the Student Worker Action Committee, and between the PCF and the International Communist Movement. That's like Maoism, And the critique of separation is not unique to the SI or it's shared by the Maoists. And I think that, there's serve the people is a kind of version of that, right? Trying to get over this division between militants and the masses. It's a kind of, we may not consider it a very good version of that. And of course the Maoists in France at the time were, somewhat ultra left in their orientation. At least they embraced an idea of spontaneity and self-organization, and they like to do things that Marxist Leninists don't really do elsewhere, and maybe share something with student militants in the U.S. and Italy in that regard. And the Italian movement was much more Marxist Leninist than has really been acknowledged. University students were opposed to regimes of testing that introduced arbitrary divisions between workers. And this was something with which young workers themselves divided by arbitrary job classifications could identify. And then this idea of refusal of labor, which, becomes thematized really in Italy, was above all a refusal of these identifications, whether student or worker. And I think that explains, that helps to kind of explain what, Dove and others describe as the great silence of the proletariat in 68. Is that, and it kind of a negative, that it was the mass strike was kind of, negative, but it didn't, factory committees, for the most part, didn't form and didn't kind of meaningfully challenge the union control over the workplace. So one reason then why workers didn't self-organize in the factories as expected according to their job specifications is that the very movement was opposed to such specification. The most activated proletarians gathered together, outside of the workplace. And when they did try to take over or occupy these workplaces, they found themselves face to face with the officials of the workers' movement, who insisted above all on the sanctity of these divisions and the inviolability an increasingly complex and injurious division of labor. So the thesis would be that there's something about the development of kind of, industrial capitalism at this moment, which, France was going through this just rapid 30 years transformation in which they went from eliminated the peasantry in 30 years and was kind of launching into a kind of post-industrial setup, but these increasingly large, corporations with highly complex divisions of labor, introduced other kinds of ideas and attitudes. And I think that, one thing you see in the ecotext is that the places where there were like factory committees that wanted to take things over were by and large in white collar and service sector workplaces, like the, electricity company or the insurance companies or, and one of the main reasons why you get this criticism of self-management from the communization side, and you see this actually in the ecotext too, they're worried about it too, but they think that people can kind of work through it, is that you have to understand from the early 60s on, there was this kind of, sort of bourgeois version of, an idea of self-management. It was completely non-revolutionary, and it was associated with the CFDT and, people like Serge Mallet. And they had this idea of, the CFDT was it was a union that had been formed out of a split from the Catholic Workers Union and largely unorganized workers in white collar workplaces. And that's, and they had this idea of the kind of new social classes and who were essentially capable of self-management. And so when the communization theory, like criticism of self-management, has to be understood as oriented toward this kind of CFDT version of it, which was particularly, stinky and was not revolutionary at all. And I think the ecotext like shows that where they, where these committees formed, they quickly became kind of new bureaucracies, and they weren't, as I read the ecotext, the problem they see in it is that it was not like sufficiently basified. It wasn't like it wasn't real. They weren't real councils because they didn't actually have their roots in the masses. It was just a new bureaucracy, a new group of, even when they were against the union, it was just people who were going to become the new union because they didn't have their roots in the workplace. So I mean, I think that's a way to sort of understand how all of these texts are responding to something pretty similar. And so, I mean, yeah, this kind of like they had to always come from outside the workplace. Like the really exciting moment in the eco text is I'm trying to find the workplace that they talk about in the moment is they think that's the kind of high point of it. But it's a march that starts from outside the workplace to try to take it over. And then they kind of end up doing, battle with the militants, the union leaders. So. I'm trying to, somebody have the ego text in front of them. It's
That's there's a Citroen factory that they talk about. I seem to remember where there was.
Oh, is it a Citroen?
Pardon me?
Yeah.
Jasper, there's some comments, questions, etc. in the
Where are they?
I don't know if you're.
Oh yeah.
They start
Would
with.
you like to read them?
No, would you like me to read them? Sure.
Sure. Sounds good.
Yeah, no problem. You're good. So this is back a while ago. I don't think this was completely traced out yet, but there was a comment at one point made about how unpublished, not unpublishable, but unpublished the Council Communist work was in general. And Fidel Costco was asking if the dearth of publishing of Council Communist type texts, was that a function of Cold War anti-communism, or are there other motivating factors behind that? Then Max made a comment about other Mattick Senior's work on crisis, for example, was dropped off for about a year mid-depression when the economy appeared to be recovering. I'm not sure which, but I think I get that. Then there's just a few other comments. I don't know if you want to trace over those before touching base on some of the other stuff, or you want to keep going?
I think, Paul, you might be able to address that. You know more about it than I do.
I say something a little bit about the first one, although I'm not really an expert. I actually thought you probably know more about it than I do. But no, I don't think it had anything to do with anti-communism. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had any interest in it. The left was the communists, the Leninists.
Yeah.
And those alternative traditions were just completely wiped out. So you had little teeny groups.
Right.
But especially after the 30s and the early 40s, when the whole war machinery got going, and Russia, instead of being Hitler's ally, joined the anti-Nazi front, then not that they chose to, but they had no choice. But so nobody was interested in these little groups of the left, and even. So I really think it was the failure of post-war communism in Europe that opened the path to that, with this sort of breakdown of the hegemony of communism and of Leninism generally, opened a path. And then it was really the student movement, and the whole recovery of Council Communism comes from the German student movement. You had all these people who it comes from the German SES, and they were reading the Grundrisse, they were reading early Marx, they were looking for an alternative Marxism to the official ones. The socialists stunk, the communists stunk, but they could see that this is still the tradition out of which some kind of opposition can be formulated. And so they went digging into the German Revolution, and lo and behold, there's all this material, which is really interesting. So somebody like Bach was really the first really important person who wrote a book on German syndicalism and council communism between the wars. And he collected enormous documentation, and it was a scholarly book published by an academic press, but then it was read by thousands and thousands of students. And then they began finding all the original documents and reprinting everything.
Mhm.
So it was really a response to the student movement of the 60s that produced this. And I think it had died out because it didn't mean anything to anybody. It was unconnected to any actual social movement that was going on anywhere. So nobody was interested, just like nobody was really interested in Marx. Not because of communism, but it just didn't seem relevant. No, you couldn't make any business out of it or do anything with it or connect it to anything.
That's not the answer I expected, though. It's an interesting one. I mean, I thought I was maybe just like making sure that it wasn't just an overwhelmingly repressive set of material relations, like constraining what would be published. I would think like maybe in the US, there are always like, and this might be wrong, whether it was disconnected from what people understood as real struggles, which sounds like sort of what you're, maybe the main takeaway of what you're saying, Paul. I would just think that there would be historically curious people maybe working out theories. It's not America's strong point for sure, but nerds somewhere interested in diagnosing what went wrong in the German Revolution or something like that. And also maybe having friction with the official CP or other official groups that maybe just fractiousness of the left. I would think that like in the US, where other than the CP, I can't imagine what authority would bear down on, I don't know, like theoretically and historically curious and perhaps even like strategically creative leftists of the time. We're talking about like the early and mid 20th century, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't mean that as a counterpoint. I'm more just issuing surprise. I would think that there's like less ideological discipline in the US than there was certainly like in the USSR and maybe other parts of Europe that had powerful CPs.
Well, it's not just about discipline, it's about the absence of readers. I mean, the people existed, but they were just writing for each other. I mean, this is why we can go and find the people who are interested in this stuff, but there's 50 of them, right? And they are writing to each other and they're reading to each other, but there's no one to read their stuff. And I think that's the thing, is that like, and in the US, yeah, sure, there were, Kenneth Rexroth was distributing, stuff like that, and like among artists and weird bohemians, this stuff kind of lit. But again, that's the margins, right? And it's not until you get this kind of mass marginalism with the student movement, which is countercultural but also massive, that you get anything big enough to convince a publisher to publish it. It's like, that's the thing. It's like the people existed, but no one would publish their work. And that's the thing. They had plenty to say, just no one to listen. And in some sense, like history had to catch up with them. And the CP and those things had to be entirely discredited. In the US, there's like almost no communist movement to speak of at all through the 50s and 60s. It's like just massively destroyed because everybody that was a part of it just like becomes a liberal. But in France, like in Italy, it's more about just the kind of success of the movement in some sense.
I think that part of the lack of opportunity for these little dissident groups to get any of their voices heard is because, in part, they don't have this overbearing CP in the US to generate a reaction. There is no failure of a standard communist movement in the post-Depression dearth and World War II to allow this dissidency to really like flourish, right? Even while real movements occur within the unemployed movement, you have like worker self-organization in the mines, et cetera. That's completely gone.
Right. So
you don't have you have a lack of two factors. You have a lack of that experience to be learned by, but also you have a lack of these overbearing CPs to oppose. Mm-hmm. So you have no opportunity for this. And similarly to my comment earlier about like Mattick Senior's published work, it has to do I think it has to do a lot with just how the U.S. economy had so much impact on whether these small groups could even publish in the first place. Yeah. So that at times they can't even, bar any of their restrictions, they can't even get their work out in the first place in pamphlets or anything.
I think everything you said is completely right and quite smart. But I can give you a concrete illustration. I once asked my father, why did you stop publishing Living Marxism? He said, the printer died. He printed it for free, with some old anarchist, and he printed the magazine. Then the printer died, so that was the end of it. And he thought, so they couldn't pay for it because the people didn't have any money, and nobody, they had 500 subscribers or 2,000 subscribers. So that it's an illustration of your point.
I do have one
concrete and that small scale.
I do have one more question, is that also, from what I understand, a lot of the earlier Council Communist works happened to the German emigre population on the East Coast, which also limited its scope to, talking about like readership, to a German-speaking audience at first, especially with, and then I just know this because I'm right now reading through the biography of your father. So that's where a lot of my thinking is coming from right now, my current reading.
Yeah, that's true too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was still, especially in Chicago, there was still a German reading, communist movement, and through the 30s, right? There was still the Arbeiterzeitung there that you could, publish in.
And then the common thread of like the Europe, I think an interesting comment was the common thread between like the left dissidents in Europe and the Maoists, with the breakdown of like Soviet hegemony and the Sino-Soviet split and 56. You also see the Maoists sort of emerge out of the same thing, opposition to like standard Marxist-Leninist doctrine of the USSR. So I think looking at why they are also in 68, and when you have so many Maoists just floating around, is for the same reason that you have these left dissident groups like the Situationist International, et cetera, social Barbarie, springing up and succeeding. It's for the same reason, at least in my mind's eye.
Yeah, that's been really clear to me in rereading it, and like I do really like Kristen Ross's book, even though it's almost entirely about the Maoists and doesn't really tell the story of this other stuff. And, she's most interested in them, but she gets at this kind of critique of separation, which animates them. And despite the kind of hatred and antagonism, there is this, I think, just common thread. And that's because they come, they come out of the same student movement kind of thing. And these were just different ways of kind of responding to the same problematic, which was, how do we deal with this new kind of bifurcated, complex society with this new division of labor, which was also turning, students were no longer clearly just kind of middle class. They were also workers, and they were going to become workers in offices and, part of the kind of military industrial complex, and not necessarily in positions of such privilege that they could see themselves as completely distinct from the proletariat. And they were sons and daughters of people who were working class. And so I think that, if you understand it in that context, then it makes a lot of sense. And like, to the question about the US, I think, yeah, it's the same thing on a much smaller scale, and there it really all has a lot to do with race, which is another structure of the division of labor, which, loomed is so large. And I think that it's often been understated, the example of the Black liberation movement and the riots in the US and civil rights was a huge inspiration for the French case, and especially the Italian. They were reading all that stuff, they were translating it. These people were kind of heroes, intellectual heroes in France. A lot of major Black intellectuals were living there. And, you know, there was, you know, in some cases, the French knew more about this than Americans. And so, I think that you know, is something that's forgotten, is the way that was, because it happened in the mid-60s, was an inspiration, you know, and people thought in the 68 thought they were doing something similar to, you know, I mean, they had kind of, you know, Europeans can never really understand race. So they're just like, yeah, we're just like the people in Detroit burning down their cities. I mean, they don't, you know, so there's like, to them, that made sense, you know, we're just like, and of course, you know, this led to, of course, in Italy, like really weird, you know, urban Indian, metropolitan Indian, I mean, really weird kind of exoticism and Orientalism that even the left in the US at this time was not capable of like being stupid enough to do, but just because the ideas about race were really different. You know, this form of identification was really strong. And of course, for the French, you know, it was identification with the Cultural Revolution that they knew almost nothing about, but they thought they were doing the same thing. And, you know, when they were taking over the workplaces, it was just like, you know, just like people in China, like, you know, beating up the petty bureaucrats in their town. But I think that it has to be said that there is a kind of red thread linking all of this. And it is this, you know, the division of labor, which I think looms large as a problem for this kind of new movement in a way that it really didn't, because it was just, you know, for one, people were much more settled in where they were. And, you know, there wasn't the same kind of, you know, mobility in the kind of historical, you know, communist movement. Although, you know, of course, Council Communism wanted to overcome the division of labor. And sort of like, you know, overcoming it from within. So, yeah.
I thought an interesting point you brought up to relate a little bit to contemporary issues, the sort of Orientalism in the Maoist movement in France is really easily like apparent in the anarchist movement here with like Kurdistan, or in general, any like autonomous like coding itself as an autonomous movement, any part of the world will immediately receive support internationally from various left offers, simply because they don't put in the due diligence to understand the real content. So we see with like this mirroring of the Cultural Revolution, for example, in my city, I'm in Portland, not too far away from Seattle, right? We have like new groups like what are they called? I think Symbiosis Rev that have put on this whole like cloak of the YPG, and then this is their political movement, you know, and it's incredibly incoherent. So the best, you know, the best that comes out of this is whatever of these movements is when they draw their conclusions off the material circumstance, right, against that oppressive hegemony. And the worst of it seems to be when it draws it from a foreign experience, because it always seems to be terribly misguided, and it's a perpetual issue in like left activism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then just to be sympathetic, because I think all that stuff is silly, but you can, it's trying to understand the Maoism of the 60s and 70s, that you have these, you know, little groups of students and professors in Paris. You think, oh, we're part of a worldwide movement, you know, just like people used to feel about Russia. We're part of a worldwide movement of peasants and workers. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, we are the, you know, just like the Weathermen had the same crazy idea. We are the American representatives of the third world. You know, we're going to be the American wing of a global third world revolution against the white oppressive capitalism. In that sense, we're not alone. And you know, that's the power. That was always the power of the communists. You know, we have Russia. You know, socialism is real. It's already there. So then you have this idea. Okay, well that didn't work out. But the new socialism that's real, it's the socialism of peasants, and it's all over the world. It's in Cuba. It's in Nicaragua. It's above all in China. And we're part of that. We're making history because we're one with a billion people are on our side. So that's it makes you feel better when you're not just harassing your professor, you're being part of the march of global history. It's much more exciting and heady feeling. So I think, you know, even now you think, oh, well, we're connected to Rojava. It's not just a crazy idea that some of us have. Oakland or Portland, or wherever you are, that it's real. There are people who there are actually women with guns in Syria who are fighting with the American Air Force, of course, but they're making socialism right now in the real world. It's not just theoretical. So that's a very seductive, and otherwise you think, we're just a bunch of people sitting around reading books and talking to each other and griping. And that doesn't seem as exciting.
Yeah.
Well, there seems to be these like attached kind of like metaphysical notions in a lot of the left movements attached to like Marxism as sort of like not just an analysis, but something which has like a magic power, which it doesn't have, right? So that just by virtue of it being there can affect change. And I think that's heavily tied into these issues. It is kind of like a heady feeling, and I don't blame anyone for it. I'm just saying it's like this. It is. I still think it is an issue, and it is perpetuating. But I'm not necessarily going to blame an activist for like going out or in like France in the streets and saying I want to pledge my support to Rojava or whatever. I want to go like flip a police car, because there is genuine discontent. There's genuine want for change, right? It's just that I'm not sure it has the content in it. It's still trapped in these like attached notions to belief, giving it extra power it doesn't have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think there's something. Yeah, it's probably a discussion for another time. I mean, also needs to be said that those movements like really draw upon international solidarity in a way that's like, they're sort of dependent upon, whether it's Zapatistas or the kind of Rojava movement, whatever you think about those things, they're also, consciously directed towards like international anarchism in a way that and that's necessary in order for them to survive. And, I think it's at least better than the old model where they would just get money from the USSR or something like that. And at least it's, building a basis for another kind of internationalism that isn't, but not to deny that there are kind of misguided ideas all around, about what is or isn't happening. But I think that, it can't just be put on one side of it. That's my point. And I think that's interesting. I mean, it just shows that the state kind of statism is no longer an option at all. And that it shows where the kind of, yeah. What do we think of this moment? I mean, I'm really interested in this kind of archetypal moment in the Perlman and Gregoire text where they march to the Citroën factory, and they're at the gates, and then it's almost like a fairy tale. The first time they go and they agree to translate for the union, and they become the union's auxiliary, and they like herd the workers, and they herd the kind of foreign workers with their capacity to speak other languages. They like help herd all the workers into the workplace, and then they are themselves left out, and they're like, whoa, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be militants. We shouldn't be an auxiliary of the union. And then there's this kind of learning process, which, for Perlman and Gregoire, they clearly didn't learn enough and quickly enough, right? And then they have these kinds of reflections after the fact about what should have been done, and the different kinds of opportunities, and they go back and they say that they're not going to work with the union any longer. They return to the gates, issuing a call for the workers to unite in a general assembly, which could directly speak for and organize the workers against the unions. They say the occupied factories have to be opened up to all comrades, workers, as well as students, in order to enable them to make decisions together. Workers and students have the same objectives. Despite the government, the universities are already open to all. If the loudspeakers decide instead of you, if the loudspeakers broadcast the decisions we have made, then the men behind the loudspeakers are not working with you. They're manipulating you. So the sort of open to all commune character of the university has to be replicated in the workplace. And it should be said that this does like happen in other places. That's pretty much what happens in Italy when they do take over workplaces. It's often this kind of hodgepodge of different people, and a lot of the base committees that get formed in Italy, which are much more successful than these. They're often like led by students who are working at the factory, and because there's just greater proletarian student content there, and connections between students and factories, they actually do kind of produce this kind of open factory occupation model. But here the calls are just drowned out. And to me, this really seems like it seems like an archetypal encounter. And I think that this idea of the General Assembly, I mean, we're still with this. We still exist in this moment 50 years later. We have not transcended it, partly because we haven't realized it, but partly we haven't figured out the limits of it. And, I mean, this is pretty much every sequence of the last 10 years that you've seen, or 15 years, or however fucking long it's been. But, the current cycle of struggles is. And so even though I think like in some ways 68 is like played out and overstated, and like people make more of it than things that are more interesting in some regards, I think it's important because, this new thing shows its head. But, that's just what I think. And I'd be interested like how this moment kind of, reads to people. Because I think that the reflections that Perlman and Gregoire develop from them are interesting because they're sort of more pragmatic and they're less tendentious than what you find in Dauvet, but they're more or less the same. And the questions that they raise there are really, interesting. And I think there are, specific practical recommendations about like taking over the radios. That's the thing that the workers themselves, I mean, that's the thing that the action committees could actually do, as much as they're like intellectuals or like an intellectual part of the kind of the workers' movement. That's like the natural thing for them to do. And in fact, when we look at Portugal, this does happen, partly because in Portugal, everything is possible because the army is in some sense semi-collapsed and you could just do whatever the hell you want for a certain while. And, they do just like, they can like crazy council communist ideas are like getting broadcast on the radios and, newspapers and, are these debates between all the various tendencies. But I don't know. I'm interested in how this appears to people. I know Paul and I have already had the conversation about this, but I'm interested in how it strikes other people.
One thing that seems to be born in 68 is the notion of the university as a factory, as a workplace that can be occupied. Mm-hmm. Or even, I remember a pamphlet that someone wrote called "The Student as Nigger." There's the student as nigger, the student as worker. I mean, I realize all of that can be over dramatized, but yet going down to the UC strike, or even looking at experiences like Allende's in Chile, where the whole notion of one of the things they did in the university was they would get all the meetings would be held and the janitors would be there with the faculty and so forth. This whole notion of thinking of this as a kind of workplace factory that needs to be changed, that we can change from within, starts to, I think, is born there and is fruitfully continued at other times.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. Andrew.
Sorry, I just turned my mic on. Yeah, I kind of think if we're thinking about like what was changed in this situation and what struggling universities represented, and it kind of some way perhaps connects with Tronti's real subsumption thesis, like the overflow of the boundaries of the factory into the space of social reproduction. But what's quite evident to me in all of these texts is that the fact that feminism doesn't yet exist in France, and it's kind of maybe like a post-68 development in French politics. But what's interesting in the eco text is at the end, there's this discussion about who will resume responsibilities and criticizing the centrality of the idea of social labor time at the center of communist economic calculation. So it kind of hints beyond 68 where the future horizon struggle is and who might take part in that struggle, because it mentions children, seniors, and how value of production is in the process of being transformed. And as such, it's kind of hinting that the rationality of if there was this difficulty of connecting students to workers in struggle, it kind of highlights the kind of docility of the corporate factory, and how perhaps the rationality of workers lies outside of the factory, and their decision making in the factory is kind of actually a result of often of external factors that often relates to their social reproduction, such as the cost of living and stuff.
I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's what this moment makes clear, and it's not that that doesn't mean that the council has been superseded. It just means that the locus of the council has to be rethought, and there were always different ideas about that within the council movement, and the locating it in the factory was more about the necessity to make sure that it's really communist and proletarian, not that like it had to be this workerist thing. There were different ideas about, I mean, Panicoke and Gorder, make remarks about how, the regional council is the most important thing. And in effect, often they were. And, so it's just, and yeah, we saw the Pankhurst piece about, kind of how that was already, she was already kind of thinking within that, thinking beyond, thinking about the inclusion of these other kind of sectors. But I think that's exactly right, is that like one way to understand what the silence of the proletariat in this moment is that in as much as they were being asked to like take over something that was what they had every day, they had no interest in it. Mm-hmm. They would be like, sure, let the unions do it. But they would be interested if it were something different, if it were actually a transformation of the factory and an overcoming of the division of labor. But in as much as that's not on the table, they're just going to be like, sure, let the unions manage it. Fuck it, I'm not interested. And that's, I think, the problem that, the problem that has to be addressed. And in some sense, that is the key insight of, Thierry Communiste and all these people. They really have interesting things to say about that, in my view. So yeah, but there's other people who wanted to jump in. Max?
I can go. I think that more than the council as it appears in any specific form, whether regional or local, I don't like to call the council a principle, right? Because the principle might give it a trans-historical character, which it doesn't have. But the theory of the council communists, right, is that there is this tendency for workers to self-organize, and that we place ourselves on that, always on that front of that self organization, or I guess for some of like the more theory communists, like self-actualization of the proletariat, depending on what, if you see it more as like Dauvet sees it, or like as I accept theory communist critique of Dauvet, where he sees it like the communist essence of the proletariat, whatever, all sort of on the same side there for different reasons. It matters most, like the question isn't to me whether, like, why didn't a council form pop up? It's what's the content, and how did workers self-actualize here, and were there counterforces, right? We do see factory committees appearing in some ways, and you brought up earlier, right, that there was in Italy, correct? You did have a more proletarian student mix, which implies, at least in some sense, that there is not a complete abolition of the divide between the school and the factory, but more like a perceived abolition of that distinction. There is a real distinction there, which could, in my mind's eye, be something which divides the movement and divides the formation of anything we would consider a council. That we do see that the student movement has its limits in trying to get to the proletarian movement that might be observed as not a large of an issue in, say, like Italy or in historical examples. Because
Totally.
in Germany, in the earliest examples of the council communist movement emerging, the student movement, I mean, it doesn't exist because there isn't a large enough student population to be significant, in my opinion. And there isn't that sort of issue. But once you have this massive action divided on one side student, on one side proletariat, you do start to really see problems. Maybe there is a sort of, there's this perceived unification of goals in abolishing the division of labor and the division of education, but differences in why each movement is coming to this conclusion. For the student movement, it might be more cultural, and for the proletarian movement, it might be because of their disenfranchisement with like the CGT or whatever other unions they may have been involved in. And that's just an idea which has been rolling around my head ever since I started reading like Theory Communiste and like Davet and now these texts regarding May 68 and the issues which pop up within pushing one way or the other.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, yeah, I mean, one way I would put it is that if the theory of the council before this moment was like a circle with its center in the factory, now it's like an ellipse, and it has like one focus in the factory, but there's also this kind of extrinsic or eccentric focus that is somewhere else, and that's what we see. But because it's not the case that you don't need the factory anymore, you absolutely do need it for the revolution. And that's what, theory communists continue to point out, is that the revolution is going to still have to pass through the factory. The fact that these marches keep coming up against the gates, or like, that is a problem. And that, until that's superseded, to simply think that you could have the revolution simply emerge outside without actually engaging, productive workers, and involving them in the kind of revolutionary process is ridiculous. And you obviously absolutely need to take over that stuff and to use it and transform it. And that's going to require the involvement of, that's going to require the involvement of the class there. And that's why they have this theory of the swerve, which, is this kind of, I don't even understand it, but it's supposed to be the thing that will resolve that by like bringing the one center into the other, collapsing the two foci of the ellipse into some new circle. So yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and that's why, to me, that's why, and so I think that in some way, when you read Davet, I'm going to have a bunch of stuff where I was saying about this, and they tell this really interesting story about, they continued meeting at Saint-Cyr for months, and they were like, what happened? And they tried to figure it out, and they like came up with this, the theory is in some sense communization theory grows directly out of the people who continue to meet at Saint-Cyr afterwards and try to figure out what happened, and it's this self-criticism. But the thesis that they develop is somewhat of a thesis from like subjectivity, right? Which is just like the workers themselves knew that self-management was pointless, and they'd already figured it out. And in some ways it's not super satisfying to argue from subjectivity, and it's kind of easy to call bullshit on it. And then I think that when you look at the longer 1970s, like in Portugal, where there were factory occupations and councils, and you know, it's in some ways the 70s was both this kind of moment of this critique of the idea and an actual renaissance in workplace takeovers. And you know, if you look at Iran and Poland and Chile and Portugal, it looks a bit different, because then you have to explain why did actually people did take these things over and did do so with a certain amount of enthusiasm, but then only to find that the process was kind of stymied. So I think the argument from subjectivity is just isn't enough, and in some way, like it has to be, yeah. I think the more ideas that, you know, that people wanted to take things over, but they wanted to know what it was for, you know, and how it would help them. So, and I think, you know, I think that that's where theory is sort of, the theory has sort of developed to take that into account. But if we assume that this simply means that the factory is no longer important, or whatever the factory is now, I think that would be wrong. And that it really has to do with like the working class having figured it all out. That's like the false thesis. It's like the working class like knew that like this would be hopeless, and they didn't want that. They wanted like an immediate, they wanted everything immediately, and they like weren't interested in you know, in what could be got through half measures. I think that that's not true.
Just a real quick question. I don't know if it's Ali or Ali, but I saw that you made a point in the chat about not wanting to be in the video. Just in case you haven't been with us before, and this goes for everybody else. If you ever don't want to be in the edit that we put online, just, you know, say before you start talking about whatever it is that you want that you would like this cut out of the edit, and then feel free to go with it wherever you want. It just helps us be able to take a timestamp and remember where to cut. But if anybody who feels that way, Ali or Ali, if you wanted to talk about this Rojava point, feel free. Sorry to interrupt on that. I can also read the point if anybody would like. Okay. I don't know. Is that of interest to anyone?
I think it's an interesting point, but it may be a little it was a little while ago, and it was kind of it's my fault. I brought up something which is a little bit of a sidetrack. I would still like to address it, but I think there are more interesting directions this conversation could follow.
Might be a good thing for Discord or something like that, or private message or whatever. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If Ali, if you do want to continue that, because I would like to respond to that on the Discord. My name is MLZ player, so I can always talk there. I would like to talk about that.
I'd encourage. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that we're at about almost an hour and a half right now on time. So just keeping track of that.
Yeah. I think we're almost, I mean, I don't know, we have that much more. I think I might have said everything. Right. I didn't read anything, but I said everything.
I thought something interesting brought up was the point about feminism in the New Left, and sort of like looking at the content of the cultural struggle within the New Left, and how I think in many ways it is like very lacking. It doesn't especially worldwide, it has very interesting implications for like feminist movements in various countries. It can be like better or worse at times, like in Japan or the US or whatever. And it's not something fully formed because I'm honestly not well schooled enough in it. I certainly haven't lived near or through it, and I don't know many people who have. But I'm curious to see, like, how did that cultural content, which often I think is so important to like May 68, which, you know, all the work regarding like the Situationist International and like me, like the reaction to how capitalist media had developed, or the spectacle had developed, or whatever, right? How did that maybe affect the development of May 68? That's just a question that I have, and I'm wondering if anyone can answer it, because I'm honestly not well informed enough.
Can you repeat your question?
Oh, how did the cultural content of the New Left affect May 68? And, you know, in many ways it's lacking in feminism. I'm wondering if there are other ways which we could like understand that it might have had impact on the development of struggle within, you know, this very important month.
What do you mean by cultural content in specific, like the SI and all that?
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah. Like specifically is the SI.
I mean, I think they were huge in setting the tone, but they like had I mean, in terms of like, you know, slogans and chants and graffiti and just a general kind of discourse, I think they had a huge effect. In terms of actual practical interventions, I think they had almost no effect. But, you know, so that's to say the SI like intervention was largely cultural and effective in that sense. And that I think the thing that needs to be understood is just that, like, you know, there were a lot of people who probably didn't really distinguish much between, like, you know, the Maoists and the Situationists. It's just that all looked the same to them. It's within this kind of thing. And in that sense, like, the kind of cultural interventions of the SI were hugely influential. And then, of course, you know, I think that the importance of their endorsement of the council form was really important and popularized it. And, you know, and in some sense, a lot of the other groups that were interested in council communism had some connection to them. And so did a lot of the, you know, the groups at Sancier. But because, you know, because the actual SI was like, I guess, 3 people at this moment or something like that. And they were so, and Debord was, you know, to his, I mean, it's hilarious that he critiques, you know, Castoriadis for being a guru, because obviously he was the most, you know, he did everything. I mean, I guess maybe he was like, he managed to never be a leader by just, you know, excommunicating everybody who pissed him off, which is his way of never being like never playing the leader to the student. He just never had any students, because he just, as soon as somebody like disagreed with him, he was just like, fuck you. And, but he stayed and they went. And so, yeah, and I think that, yeah, as I said, they were at Sorbonne, you know, with their council for the maintenance of the occupations, and then just like sending telegrams to Beijing and Moscow saying, you know, quake in your boots, bureaucrats, or whatever like that. But I don't think that but the influence of that model and the very idea of kind of provocation is, I think, really huge. And in some sense,
retrospective. I mean, essentially, they were a retrospective effect. They've retrospectively come to stand in with some of the slogans like "Beach Beneath the Street," or some of the famous graphics like the one with the 2 cowboys from some Western with "De quoi penses-tu?" de la réification, and so forth. I mean, this has almost come to stand in for 68 in a sort of a general way afterwards.
True.
Well, I think much like we see the 18th Brumaire stand in for the 1848 revolution. It was written before, but didn't have a terrible, you know, or sorry, the manifesto was written before 1848. 1848 happened. And then we see the manifesto as Brumaire is accentuating the proletariat's action during the revolutions of 1848. And then we see the Situationist International reach Society of the Spectacle, and then May 68. and it has a larger impact this time, but then we see the Situationists stand in for the content of May 68.
Yeah. Except the Communist Manifesto was hardly read by anyone in 1848,
exactly.
and hardly read by anyone until Engels like republished it, until they republished it later, and then it became this big thing. But like they ignored it until I think, you know, until the 1870s, and then they re-released it. You know, it wasn't an important text for them, and then the communist movement sort of used it afterwards. But I don't think anybody really read it until like the 1880s, hardly. Because it has all those prefaces, you know, but anyways, you know, I mean, I think, you know, some people read it at the time, but not that many. I think that's right. What I will say is that the SI develops as critique of militancy, the militant, but they also are pro engagement. They have this idea of the avant-garde as this kind of catalytic force, which I think, you know, as you know, I've been trying to develop this kind of theory of the active minority from the Appel and the KPD, and I think in some sense that's, you know, what you're getting in the Perlman Gregoire piece, which is, you know, to neither be a militant nor to kind of be entirely passive, but to actually think about what kind of intervention is meaningful. I think that comes from the SI, although De Boer was incapable of actually really figuring out what that would be, because it was partly at the realm of like stunts and, you know, things like that. And communization theory has to be said, like for its first 15 years is in some sense under the halo of this and engages in a lot of incredibly stupid shit. Some of the people involved with it really, you know, and it gets mixed up with all kinds of, you know, stupid stuff, and then you have to read their kind of self-criticism, right? And so it really only like becomes it only really sort of develops in the 80s once it shakes off the legacy of kind of avant-garde provocation and this idea that you can, like, you know, attack the spectacle through these interventions on this plane of discourse, which is sort of so stupid. But yeah, I think that there's something that can be traced back to the SI that's interesting here. Yeah, Paul.
I have to say, I think everybody was wrestling with this at the time. You know, all the people who had come out of those organizations and had found themselves in this new situation, everybody had the same problem. How do I be active without claiming to be the incarnation of history? You know, to be an active participant without claiming leadership, or, you know, or even how do I express my point of view and say what I think is right without claiming that everybody else has to agree with me, or without foreclosing discussion. But that was a general problem that, you know, I guess I resist a little bit connecting it to the most famous people who got picked up and made into culture celebrities, De Boer and a few people who became official French representatives of the last left avant-garde, because everybody was thinking about the same problem. You know, right. How do we engage in political activity without having a line, you know, without having a claim that we have the correct theory and that everybody has to agree with us, and yet to have some kind of coherent activity and not just sit around waiting for things to happen. And that's, you know, I imagine everybody I'm looking at on the screen is thinking about that. But everybody started thinking about that in the 60s already. That's the big problem. Once the big organizations collapse or show that that is not the way forward, and once the big theories are no longer believable as problem-solving guides for everybody and everything. So, you know, and there seemed like there was a moment when you could say, oh no, Mao Zedong knows, we have the red book, and that was, but, you know, that's just nonsense. But anybody who was serious was thinking about exactly that problem. What is the alternative to being a militant or to being an apparatchik, or the boss of an organization? Those are the big, that's the big problem. I think it was a general discussion. Like you could see in ECO, there were the people who, like Henri Simon, said, all we should do is gather information and share it. And then there were other people who said, no, we have to formulate our own ideas and say, this is what we think should happen. Oh, but that's having a theory. That's bad. Then you're back with Stalinism. No, it's not. You can have a theory with that. That was the discussion that was going on. Very general.
But I would say the American 68, I'd make 2 points. If we're going back to the notion of repeating 68, which is to go back to the time and figure out the roads that were not taken or so forth. One is when you look at, let's say, SDS, the plan to bomb a soldier's dance in New Jersey. They were making the bombs that blew up. You would say, well, there's an example of what not having theory or even any history allows, that kind of event, And the second thing I'd say is that the media, in a certain way, selected those aspects of 68 at Columbia that they wanted to heighten. There were actually all sorts of things going on. For example, the Young Lords was formed out of the Columbia thing, Juan Gonzalez, and that led to a whole series of occupation and rent strikes and so forth. It was the first strike where the Black Student Union and SDS did something together, which was a huge moment. And though it was originally built around the idea of returning some letters, writing a letter to the administration about students in the Vietnam War, it became about occupying the gym that was occupying Harlem and Morningside Park. So suddenly, there were sort of Black issues that got started out of 68, but the media picked up Mark Rudd as the kind of central factor in 68, and this notion of occupying universities, which then became a thing around the country, and ignored the kind of birth of all these kind of fruitful side actions and movements that had come out of a very complex event. So I say, in a certain way, we have to go back to 68 and figure out all the things that weren't followed through or that started, and yeah, well, I mean, that's, I think everybody agrees on that.
I would like to just respond. I think Fidel Costco made a very good point about the historical zeitgeist of the party line, which actually, I was thinking about this because of how much 68 did completely emaciate, just destroy the left. There's kind of been like a reset on any lessons learned from that. To the extent where we still have people and like local activists who are waving around this horrid little thing, and like it's almost like, at least in the U.S. left, it's like the lesson has not been learned, and we're seeing like a return to all this like Leninist crap, because there's just been like a disconnect of knowledge. And when you look back at history, if you're a new communist without anyone to guide you, what's going to come up first is like Marx, Lenin, right? However, I find interesting the communizers in, how they took on the problem of becoming being an activist, but not being the Leninist, right? Trying to like learn historical lesson, right? As we were talking about from actions during the German Revolution, and the conclusion they kind of reach is that the original council communists kind of had it going, and not out of any particular. I don't think out of any particular theory, but it just kind of developed out of material circumstance. So it is as much, as much as it's trying to be theorized. I think it is, this sort of these things happen naturally as well. The real danger is that when we see the counter-revolutionary role being filled, it's always by people who will hold up books like this or whatever, and then that has a terrible effect. It had a terrible effect in Germany, and I think it also has a terrible effect in France, where you have like the stamping out of that sort of natural development by whether it be like the CGT or any of these hulking bureaucratic organizations or Bolshevization in Germany in the 1920s?
Well, they probably hold up Foundations of Leninism, which was written by Stalin. I mean, we must remember that Leninism is the creation of Stalin. And one can find throughout Lenin's career moments of extreme flexibility and intelligence. So, I mean, we can be against Leninism of finding Lenin a source of intriguing ideas about action. So.
Well, that's where, you get the communizers getting like Bordigist influence. You do have like an influence of Lenin that re-enters Council's discourse.
I wanted to draw attention to this one sentence in the Root and Branch introduction, which I think speaks precisely to Paul's point. And I didn't mean to say that it was unique to the SI, just that it's reflected in their theory. But I think that this is an interesting paragraph, because it shows that, like, while there may be a difference between, the eco and the pro-Grégoire text, it is the same problematic. And it says, and they specifically actually identify, I think, non-Leninist, militancy, which is interesting, which is precisely what the pro-Grégoire piece does. It says the error of the sex is made as well by those who, while not Leninist, ascribe the failure of the revolution to lack of initiative on the part of militants, or even their failure to occupy government ministries. The general point is not to deny the importance of decisive and imaginative actions by militant minorities in the triggering of mass action, but only to recognize that the limits and general character of a social movement are set by the spirit of the masses and not by that of revolutionary groups. From this, it follows that such groups can contribute to the deepening and revolutionary definition of an upheaval, not by attempting to take control of it, but by taking as their main task the fostering of initiative and self-organization by the mass of people involved. And so, I mean, I think that that is the question, like, what is it? What does it mean to foster initiative and self-organization, and what actions do or do not do that, and what actions are or are not the attempt to take control? And I think that that's what's to be debated in some sense, but this position kind of narrows that down to, like, what is it? What would be that thing? And I think that, in a sense, that's what I'm saying is, the KPD Appel theory is within this, is from within this perspective, and the SI are from within this perspective, and eco are within this perspective, and so are Pro and Grégoire, but they have different ideas about what it is, and probably all of them are wrong, since that's the way it works, but we can't rule out the possibility that there are some things that do that, or else it would just be to kind of so who is JKR, Paul? That was you? Okay. Okay. So you wrote that. I wasn't sure if that was Dave Brecker or you. Okay, so you wrote that. Okay, good.
But just to give just to make it more concrete, a concrete answer, it seems to me that the classic example is one that you probably discussed before I joined this group, which is, where you had the moment in Germany when you had the councils and then you had the National Assembly. So that was, which was it going to be? Who was the power going to be taken by the elected assembly, politicians, or was it going to be the councils? And then you could say the councilists, as you would expect, said, no, the workers have to maintain the control of the process, not give it over to the politicians in the National Assembly. So that would be like, that seems to me a very concrete example, historical example of where you have a very clear division between, if you go in one direction, then you heighten the involvement of large numbers of people in actually making political decisions. If you go in the other, you take it away from them and you give it to the usual crew of people who run things. And the workers made the wrong decision. They gave it up. They said, no, we don't want to, we're tired. We've had a war, we've had a revolution, now we will let the politicians solve this problem. And that was the end of it. But I mean, I think it's always you can see in any concrete situation, those alternatives open up. Do we let this bunch of people make the decisions, but then you have to make the decisions, and you have to then find some form of decision-making to decide, whether it's a group decision or little groups or, whatever it is. How do you move things forward and get more people engaged in action and activity, as opposed to fewer. But that's the problem, yes.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like I don't want to extend the discussion past its natural limits, but just to come back to Philip's point earlier about like there is no Leninism, as dynamic as Lenin, Lenin, if we want to ascribe him a specific political thought is, we can see it change from like state and revolution to whatever the hell else. When I'm referring to Leninism, I'm referring to like 20s Bolshevization. I'm talking about that. I just wanted to clarify that point, that very specific thing. And that's because, yes, I mean, I've been hosting my own little reading group on Open Letter to Comrade Lenin, so it's topical in my mind. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah. Well, do we have any final remarks? It feels like we've kind of perhaps come to a natural endpoint, which is always nice. Things feel like should develop rather than having to shut things off prematurely.
I think there might be something I want to bring up real quick.
Great.
That's all right. Well, I just sort of tying it back to last session where we read The American Worker and sort of this focus on the workers' inquiry. I read recently an essay by von der Linden on socialism and Barbary, and he explores very briefly that group was trying to do that kind of thing in France as early as 1954, which I found very interesting because that was sort of, we read all these texts about, like on the SI's front, the kind of cultural influence prior to May 68, and then obviously we have all these post-mortems of May 68. And I thought that was really interesting. Is like this was a real action that that this revolutionary group was doing, over a decade prior to May 68 breaking out. And so, I'm sure many in this group are somewhat sympathetic to the workers' inquiry way of, trying to popularize self-organization and get workers to kind of be thinking about things on their own terms. I just thought that was like an interesting, like a pre-revolutionary activity that I'm not sure how much it influenced 68 in the end, but certainly could have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, those groups are around to be boosted by it, right? I mean, like the eco exists, it comes directly out of that, but it was like this very small group, and then it exploded after 68. And and actually, according to the narrative Henri Simon tells, is like that was a problem because all these people joined who weren't sort of ready. It changed the character of the group, and they had to become a changé mouvement and like restart again. But it was, yeah, absolutely. There would have, there needed to be some groups there to join, and there were, yeah, and that does speak to the very different context of France, and the fact that there were. By 68, many groups doing interested in Council Communism and some version of workers' inquiry or something like that. It's unique in some sense to France. And yeah, a lot of it is, some of it is the SI, but it's also, as Paul Mattick points out, Serge Bricanier and the group around them, and Novan and Maximilien Rubel. Who was, I don't know a ton about these people, but yeah, they had, it had to be those people doing it and coming together to create something to be boosted. Well, okay. So next time, Portugal. There's a lot to read. I didn't really edit I didn't really edit things down, so it's a fair amount of material, but it's all incredibly interesting. I mean, I think that the Portugal moment is just fascinating, and to me, it's almost like this compressed history of like everything we've like. It's like because they had no workers' movement, it's like it goes to the entire 70-year sequence that we're reading and like comes to the end, in some weird. It's almost so it works almost like a reprisal of everything that we've read because everything is there, including new things, that we haven't dealt with, like, anti-colonialism and the kind of post-colonial moment, but anti-fascism, the Workers' Council, unions, this cultural dimension, feminism, all and the kind of, action extrinsic to the workplace and both within it, is all the issues are there in this kind of fascinating way. The role of the army, I think, it really highlights the kind of the centrality of that of armed power, which we haven't maybe talked about enough, and so yeah, looking forward to it. And then I think we'll do a thing on Italy that hopefully my friend Diego will help guide us through, who reads in Italian and is doing a lot of research on this period, and then we can talk about where to go from there. Cool.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, everyone. I know I'm a little late.
Thanks.
Nice meeting all of you.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Thank you, Red May.